Most recently in an article entitled Myth of the Free Press, he tears through the official legend around the United States of America's allegedly free fourth estate. I sat down with the Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and asked him just what is the myth of the free press.
The myth is that the press is not fettered, that there are no parameters, that it can say whatever it wants, that it can speak truth to power. In fact, the parameters are extremely narrow, especially, for instance, on issues of national security. I worked for 15 years for the New York Times, and the unofficial motto of the New York Times is, we will not significantly alienate those on whom we depend for money, which is our advertisers, or access, which are the powerful. Now, you can alienate them sometimes, but you better not make a habit of it. You saw in the buildup to the invasion of Iraq during the Bush administration that reporters understood that not to get on the bandwagon and, in essence, become a cheerleader for this war was very detrimental to their career, and it was extremely detrimental to my career because I left the New York Times over it.
What's interesting is that you saw then a lot of kind of mea culpas long after the fact. Oh, I should have asked more, I should have done this. And
when it's safe.
When it's safe. And then when you saw kind of a ramp up to go, into Syria, before all of the ISIS situation last summer, you suddenly saw a lot more harder questions, or at least initially you saw a lot more harder questions being asked and a lot more alternative independent media kind of stepping up saying, wait a minute, this is no good. But then you saw mainstream press kind of push, and then they pulled back because, was that just due because they saw how unpopular that would have been?
The thing about the press is, which I think, and this again gets into the myth of the press. The myth is the press is a reactive entity. So, for instance, let's take the Vietnam War, which is, a decade long. We've now been in the Middle East for, 12 or 13 years. So the first half of the Vietnam War, when it had broad support, the press wrote this mythic version of the war. We're liberating the Vietnamese, we're protecting the world from communism, our wonderful, hometown boys are going over there, and whatever. Once the population turned against the war, because of the body bags that were coming home, including middle-class kids, then the press was freed from a mythic narrative for what I would call, or I think what Lawrence LeSean calls a sensory narrative, i.e. you were free to go out and just report what was happening. But the press did not do that until the public mood had changed. And we saw that with Syria. You saw kind of, as you mentioned, a cheerleading to go into Syria, and the public said enough. Because, we know from opinion polls that the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are highly unpopular. And when the public sort of refused to buy on to the Syrian intervention, that's a classic example. The press changed its tune to be in conformity with the wider public opinion.
So we as U.S. citizens still can, keep the press, the mainstream press in line, so to speak, for maybe lack of a better term, just by simply being active, voicing our opinions constantly and letting them know that we disagree with the direction the country's going in. There is still hope in that. It's not completely kind of bought and sold.
Well, I'm a little more pessimistic because the American public is so easily manipulated by forms of propaganda and by the press. And I would, as an example, give ISIS. You have militarized drone strikes, cruise missile strikes, Hellfire missile strikes. These people have been brutalized. Hundreds of thousands of dead, millions of refugees. We have decapitated far more people, including children, than ISIS ever has. But we don't see that. We don't see the effects of our brutality and our violence. We see the reaction to that brutality and violence. So we don't understand, in essence, how the brutalized became brutal. We don't understand that these figures are our creation. And that's dangerous, because that is the failure of the press. A functioning press, and to understand is not to condone, I'm not condoning this, but we have to understand. We have to understand what we're doing, and we have to understand the effects of what we're doing.
Why has it been so easy to maintain that insulation?
You have whole news organizations that have really given up the business of news. And you turn on the nightly news broadcast, It's just a version of, an endless version of the Today Show. Health and wellness tips and Kim Kardashian's latest photo, and it's pathetic. As I speak as a journalist, it's just really dispiriting. And so Americans have never been particularly good about understanding what they do and how they're perceived. But now it's just a giant black hole. It's almost impossible to even get the information at all, because the mainstream press, it just doesn't do it. There's been a terrible deterioration. Huge swaths of the news industry are really in the business of entertainment, not news. They'll throw news in if it's entertaining, but they don't make any, and I would include at this point, all of the commercial news networks. They're not in the news business at all.
What do you see as the future of the media right now? Do you see it getting a lot worse, or do you see us being able to change it for the better? Or will alternative media kind of fill the gap?
The problem with alternative media is you can't make any money. So what will happen with journalism is the same thing that's happened with the arts, where you'll have journalists, but they will operate, first of all, on the fringes of society, and secondly, it's going to be very hard for them to make a living. There was, when I began as a journalist, it was possible to enter the mainstream media with some integrity and make a middle-class salary and have a pension, and it's all gone. So essentially, the journalists are going to become members of the working class, maybe even the working poor. I mean, if they're really serious about telling the truth, rather than reporting celebrity news and all this stuff. They are not going to be given a platform within the mainstream. And I think that, what's happened to classical music, what's happened to classical theater, is in essence happening to journalism. Art has been commercialized. Just walk down Broadway in the same way that journalism has been commercialized. And with this reconfiguration of American society, courtesy of this corporate coup d'etat that's taken place, and this vast concentration of wealth among an oligarchic elite, they in essence make war on anything that deals with beauty or truth, anything that has the power to transform, to make people question, to make people think. And you see it across the cultural and political spectrum. That's why you have charter schools, that's why you have people essentially being trained vocationally. And I think that journalism, like all of these professions, that seek to make people step back and examine themselves, their society, through economic pressure, are either being snuffed out or relegated to such a tiny corner of the landscape that they're almost irrelevant. That's what's happening.
If journalism kind of goes the way of good artistic expression, that's a pretty bleak future.
Well, it's called totalitarianism, and we live, as Sheldon Wolin, probably our greatest living political philosopher, would say, in a species of corporate totalitarianism, which is, it's different from fascism, it's different from communism, but it also has, very similar characteristics, and it can use that kind of soft power of money to achieve, the harsher forms of censorship. I am free to say whatever I want, but number one, I'm not remunerated for it financially, which makes it difficult to make a living, and number two, all of these critiques are carried out on the fringes of the society, and it's very evident to me. I mean, if I go to Canada, I was just in Canada, so I gave a lecture in Canada, and the CBC recorded the entire lecture and then interviewed me the next day in the studio and is producing a 1-hour show around it. The same is true in France, and Chomsky has the same effect. And yet when you come back here and offer this kind of critique of the corporate state, you might as well be a leper.